It is a wishful thinking. It is not something that is going to endure. So languages from 6,000 now reduced to 6,000 to 600, and moving very fast. Many languages, every year, some languages disappear. Not only in the linguistic world, but in our actual experience, and especially in the highly developed societies. So many people believe that my position, using a cultural analysis, is a form of cultural determinism. In a way, you try to freeze culture. Culture is considered something immutable. So each civilization may still maintain its own culture, which is, of course, a rather ridiculous position to take, because these communications and interactions are so obvious. But my interpretation of a cultural analysis is not a reductionist model. This is very important, not a reductionist model. It's not cultural analysis as pitted against economic analysis. And my position is as follows. If a phenomenon that is very easily explained in terms of economic use of the game, then you really don't have to worry about other factors. You know, for some of you involved in the discipline of economics, you're always worried about externalities, even environment, not to mention government, social conditions, and so forth. These are externalities. The economists cannot worry about those externalities because they really want to focus on the economic use of the game. So my assumption is, if something that happens, like the financial crisis, like a question about inflation, a question about trade, and you do a very sophisticated economic analysis, you'll be able to understand what happens. If that's the case, I totally subscribe to the position of the economist to understand that phenomenon. You don't have to worry too much about any other things. However, if economic analysis is not good enough, in other words, it cannot explain the situation, there's so many other factors that need to be taken into consideration, then economists are willing to think about or to incorporate political institutions or political factors, such as the role of the government in their analysis. It's unavoidable. So politics is incorporated in that particular analysis. It's much more complicated than a simple economic analysis. If you evoke the political concerns, political issues, you still cannot really understand what happened, especially in the long term. Not the crisis you're going to deal with, but some phenomena that you cannot explain, even if you take into consideration of both economic and political factors. One very important discipline which for years and years helped us to understand our world somehow disappeared in the academic community, that's political economy. And of course only the Kennedy School, people there are worried about political economy. And most of them are not necessarily trained as economists. If you still don't, you really have to evoke social factors, such as habits of the heart, such as people's work ethic, such as how communities we call sometimes called social capital functions, and how various kinds of social organizations either are positive or negative in terms of economic performance. But you still are not satisfied. Then you have to evoke the question of culture. Okay? In other words, culture is an added value. The complexity is that if you are interested in offer an explanation by using culture as an integral part, as an integral part of this analysis, you cannot afford not to be concerned about society, politics, and economics. Just like if you're interested in self-cultivation, And you cannot but continue with your interest in that area once you, even if you move into regulation of the governance of the state and universal peace. In this whole analysis, self-cultivation is relevant. Let's assume that culture is pervasive. Culture is everywhere. So you have to take into consideration of political culture, economic culture. Actually, an institute for the study of economic culture was established at Boston University under the leadership of Berger. And of course, society is deeply rooted in culture, and not to mention the culture area. But what is culture, right? The question. Let's simply, suspend that question and continue to do our analysis. Now, if this is acceptable, in other words, culture is not a reductionist analysis. It's a more complex analysis of economics. An economist may not be deeply worried about politics. A political scientist may not be worried too much about society. A sociologist sometimes is not interested in culture. But a culturalist, as I understand it, will have to be interested in all these things. Which does not mean that someone who's involved in cultural studies will have to be